Greetings from the west coast of Sweden. This is Henrik Palmgren and you are listening to Red Ice Creations Radio. The website is redicecreations.com. That's REDICE creations.com. Frequently updated news, links, resources, and of course a growing radio archive. We also have a member section where we have a lot of extended interviews with many of our guests. We also have films, articles, and other extra materials there for you. It's a very good resource for those of you who want to dive further into the many subjects that we highlight on this program. And today we're going to dive into the topics of entheogen, sacred ecology, and Gordon Wasson and his thesis on the origins of religion, and much more. We have John Lash with us on the line, and for those of you who are regular listeners, you know that we had John with us about 3 months ago now. We had a very interesting program back then talking about his book, Not in His Image, Gnostic Vision, Sacred Ecology, and the Future of Belief. We talked very much about the archons, but not as much about sacred ecology, so this is what we'll kind of dive further into today. John's website that you need to take a look at is metahistory.org. That's an excellent and a vast resource with tons of articles for you to explore further. Metahistory.org. Also take a look at his companion site, futureprimitive.org, where you can find podcasts and a lot of other material that goes alongside the material on metahistory. So let's say hi to our guest. Hi, John. It's a pleasure having you back on the program again.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Excellent, and great to have you back. I thought we'd begin this program to talk a little bit about Gordon Wasson and ethnomycology. For those who don't know, if you will, John, tell us a little bit of background on Gordon Wasson, if you will.
Well, Gordon Wasson was a strange man in the sense that he was a very conventional man. He was a banker who worked in New York, a banker and a financier, and he died, I think, in 1986. He was a very conventional man who dressed very much as businessmen do and so forth. And yet it turns out that this man, Gordon Wasson, is connected with probably the most revolutionary event that happened in the 20th century, at least one of the most revolutionary events, and that was the discovery of the mushroom cult in Mexico, the mushroom cult of the Mazatec Indians, and consequently, subsequent to that discovery was, the whole psychedelic revolution of the 60s really came about through this strange banker named Gordon Wasson.
That's interesting. And, I mean, I kind of have connected Gordon Wasson a little bit with the other man who wrote Sacred Mushroom and the Cross.
John Allegro.
John Allegro, thank you. Yeah, is there a connection between those two in any way?
There is the Wasson thesis on the origin of religion, and we'll discuss this, and I'll describe exactly what it is. It's a big phrase, but it's not exactly that complicated to describe. And John Allegro is someone who came along a little bit after Wasson, and his view is what I would call a kind of spin-off of the Wasson thesis. Mm-hmm. It has had 3 spin-offs. One of them was by John Allegro, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. Another spin-off from the Wasson thesis was by Professor Carl Ruck, who still is alive, and he teaches Greek at Boston University. And then, of course, there was Terence McKenna, who drew very deeply from the Wasson thesis and had his own particular spin-off. So since it was introduced in the early 1950s, several people have taken Wasson's idea and elaborated it in one way or another.
I see. And so, I mean, let's dive into it here then. The Wasson thesis on the origin of religion. Are we solely talking about Christianity here, or does this go way, way further back than that?
It goes back. We're not talking about the origin of religion in the sense of the building of the Temple of Solomon. We're not talking about the Ten Commandments or even the ancient Persian writings and the ancient writings of India that may have preceded the Bible. we're basically talking, the Wasson thesis is really about the origin of the religious experience.
Mm.
What we need to understand when we approach Wasson is that religion may be defined as a structure of teachings, of dogmas and doctrines, as well as an organization and a hierarchy. Typically, for instance, the Catholic religion consists of certain teachings.
Right.
It consists of a hierarchy of men who apply those teachings, and it consists of a vast organization of churches. All of this is religion. And then you can look at Hinduism or any other kind of religion in the same respect. The Wasson thesis does not explain the origin of those religions as such. It explains the origin of humanity's first religious experience.
Mm.
And according to Wasson, it's very simple. All religions began, all religions that later evolved on this planet to the form they have today, they all began from a visionary trance induced by the ingestion of certain psychoactive plants, particularly mushrooms.
And these mushrooms, we're talking about the ancient cults here in a way. Could these be found all over the world at this point, or is this restricted to one area on the planet?
Not really restricted to one area. Wasson concentrated a lot on Russia and the Ural Mountains, and he concentrated on Siberian shamanism, and he concentrated on one particular mushroom called the Amanita muscaria, or fly agaric mushroom.
Right.
But then, strangely, there are some contradictions in Wasson's work, and it doesn't always hang together. The actual mushroom ceremonies that he himself experienced were in Mexico.
Right.
And in that case, he used a different species. He used the psilocybe species, or the blue-staining magic mushrooms that are, of course, well known around the world today. Those are the mushrooms that had been traditionally used by the Mazatec Indians in Oaxaca, the mountains of Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so, as the Wasson thesis, the general thesis, developed, it became obvious that different species of mushrooms could have been used in these primordial rites.
Right. And because, South America is something, to me at least, that instantly comes to mind when talking about entheogens, and that has kind of been associated with it. But what you're saying here is that this is pretty much widespread across the globe then, right?
It certainly is. There are very few places on the Earth, except in the remote areas of Alaska, in the Arctic, where some kind of psychoactive plants do not grow. And so whether it be ayahuasca in Peru and the Amazon, whether it be the psilocybin mushrooms that grow all over the British Isles, whether it be amanita, which grows in your area of the world as well, wherever there are fir forests. So there are many candidates. It's still under discussion which particular mushroom had inspired the first religious experience. In my view, I think it's logical to say that various kinds of mushrooms were involved, but the same religious experience came out of these different species.
And would you say at this point then that is because it's the same psychoactive substance in all of them? Is that correct?
Well, of course they have different properties, but primarily, for instance, Amanita muscaria has different properties than psilocybin mushrooms. As you know, I've been studying illuminated manuscripts and other things such as Roman and Greek art, which depict mushrooms in religious scenes. And I'm convinced from this evidence that the mushrooms that were most commonly used in these early religious rites were the blue-staining psilocybe mushrooms. Mm-hmm. Because those are the ones that are most clearly depicted and frequently depicted in a lot of the artifacts. Secondly, the Amanita muscaria mushroom is also depicted. Everyone knows what that looks like. That's the Christmas tree mushroom.
Right.
The big red one with white spots.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there are problems with the Amanita muscaria because experimentation shows that its effects are very variable and inconsistent, whereas the religious and illuminating effects of the psilocybe mushrooms are much clearer and easily proven. So I'm inclined to follow that path in trying to prove or demonstrate the Wasson thesis.
And I mean, so what would you say kind of have defined this? I mean, do you think that man back then basically stumbled across this in some way, and this then a consequence of that after ingesting it, or otherwise profoundly changed man's perception of reality? Tell us a little bit about the background of what you think were going on back then.
Well, Wasson claims, as I said, and I'll repeat it again because it is a simple concept, but a very far-reaching one. Before there were any religions as such, before there were priests, before there were churches, when we were living in the Paleolithic age, and we were living in tribal situations, people ingested psychoactive mushrooms and went into a visionary trance and had religious experiences. They had illuminations. And from those illuminations, eventually, what we call religion was developed. Now, you pose a very good question. I mean, did they just kind of stumble on these mushrooms, or how did this happen? I don't really have a view on that, but I think that the testimony of Albert Hofmann here would be quite relevant. You know, Albert Hofmann, who just died recently, he was 102 years old, was the Swiss chemist who discovered LSD, who made LSD and who discovered its properties. And as the story goes, in the 1940s, when he was working for Sandoz Labs in Basel, they had made several LSD compounds, and they were trying to find something to help women in childbirth, because LSD is synthesized from ergot, from a fungus of ergot, and that is known to have been used by midwives to help contractions. Well, anyway, it wasn't working out very well, and Hoffman had made these formulas of LSD in a powder form, and he had shelved them in his laboratory. And he explains how one day in 1947, when he was alone in his laboratory working, that he, 1943, that he heard sort of LSD calling to him. He sort of heard the chemical, or the spirit in that chemical, calling to him. And as a result of that, he took down the compound from the shelf, and he began to manipulate it and got some accidentally on his fingers. And then he had the first LSD experience, and from then on, of course, it developed very rapidly. My guess would be that when our ancestors were out in nature, they were extremely observant of the natural world, and that they would have noticed certain plants and would have perhaps had a kind of reception to these psychoactive plants. Of course, they may have just eaten them accidentally. That's always possible, because they are edible, and there they are sticking up out of the ground. But I also have a feeling that there was a communication between our species and nature that has always been present. And that had something to do with us being called toward these plants and being drawn into the experiences that these plants offer us.
Right. And I mean, if we talk about Terence McKenna again, I mean, I know that he's spoken a lot about the fact that he thinks even that things like language and art has kind of spawned out of this relationship almost with these various psychoactive substances. I don't know if that's something that you endorse at all, or feel it's... I
do. I endorse that very strongly. Terence's spin-off on the Wasson thesis was not merely, he didn't just accept the primary idea that our first visions of God and visions of divinity came through these psychoactive mushrooms. He accepted that totally. But he went further than Wasson, and he said that probably our very brains and the circuitry of our neurological circuits that allows us to use language and to form symbols and create art was probably enhanced and